Thank you, everybody, for joining this session today. I'm extremely honored to be part of this event, especially, this is a topic that I love. It's something that we have SQL Server 2022 around the corner. It's going to be released hopefully soon. So the idea today is to have a brief introduction on some of the features that we will see in the final product, but we can also start playing around a little bit today, right? So the name of this session is Introduction to SQL Server 2022. A little bit about myself. My name is Javier Villegas. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work at the Mediterranean Shipping Company as IT director in the DBA and BI services areas. I've been working with SQL Server for more than 25 years. I am Microsoft MVP since 2016 and also Microsoft Certified Trainer. I'm also one of the members of the Azure Data Community Advisory Council. I'm one of the organizers and leader of our local community down here, SQL Argentina. So we have our meetings. We just had one recently in person after a while, in where we also talk about SQL Server 2022. It is in Spanish, so if you would like to join us, feel free to reach for us. In the left side of the screen, you have my contact information, my email address, Twitter, LinkedIn, and my blog, in case you would like to reach me if you have any question about this presentation, or if you just only want to do networking, and happy to connect with all of you. All right, SQL Server 2022 was announced last year during Build, right? Back then, it was announced as something about to come. And at that point, only few customers and MVPs had access to the bits to start playing around, right? This is what Microsoft called private preview. So we were part of the early steps of the product. So we were able to interact with Microsoft, provide our feedback, test the product with our own workload, and be part of the release eventually. So this year, few months ago during Build, Microsoft presented this as a public preview. So at that point, we were all able to go to the SQL Server page and download the public preview. So now the scope is a little bit more wider, so everybody can test these features and test it with their own workload, right? At this point, we have what Microsoft called Release Candidate 1. So that means that soon we should see the final product. It was announced with an interesting concept of this hybrid data services. We will try to understand a little bit what this means and how we can take advantage of all this, right? So SQL Server 22 is a new product, right? But it's a part of what Microsoft called this modern SQL Server version, right? Starting with SQL Server 2016, in where there were a bunch of features introduced back then, which are today the foundation of many of the new features that we will see with SQL Server 2022. So this was kind of a journey starting on 2016, then moving to SQL Server 2017, which the big announcements of the possibility of running SQL Server in the major Linux distribution, right? As well as enhancement in many other areas, especially performance, the part that I like the most, but not only. And then, you know, in SQL Server 2019, also with the introduction of many other new features. So this is, you know, the continuation of many of these features that we saw before, and also certain new enhancements that we will try to cover today. So SQL Server 2022 is mainly this slide, which is a marketing slide, but represents quite well all the points that we would like to cover, right? And this is also trying to explain the first part of the slide, this concept of hybrid data services, right? We will see how we can enhance our business continuity, let's say, having a distributed availability group between SQL Server 2022 and managed instance, right? For the first time, we will be able to have managed instance as part of our distributed availability group and eventually use it for disaster recovery. So that will help us to enhance our high availability, right? And again, this is part of this hybrid data services, because we will have certain interaction between SQL Server on-premise, the product that we all know and use and love, and Azure, right, with managed instance. Moving on, we will also have the possibility of seeing this new feature, which is great for you know, people who does BI, right, and data warehousing, which is Azure Synapse Link, right? Again, trying to join or to link SQL Server 2022 with Synapse Analytics, right? What is this feature, Azure Synapse Link? Well, in few words, will help us to do synchronization of certain tables that we have in our operational SQL Server 2022 with a dedicated SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics in almost real time, right? That will definitely help us to, in some cases, replace our ETLs. We will talk more and we will see it in action, right? Another point of this hybrid data platform is the integration with Microsoft Purview, right? You know, Purview is this service in Azure, which initially was the Azure Data Catalog, and then rebranded as Microsoft Purview, right? Which will help us to do governance and get insight of our data, right, in a very seamless way. Super interesting to see, right? And with this, you see that now we saw 3 features which are interacting with managed instance, with Synapse Analytics, and with Purview, right? So definitely SQL Server 2022 is really, really well integrated with Azure, right? Then we have this concept of cryptography, right? Blockchains within SQL Server with SQL Server Ledger, right? We will have the possibility of using this in our tables, right? And we will see it in action to see how we can use this cryptography within SQL Server 2022. And then the last part is also the performance part, right? This is the part, as I said before, that I like the most. There are many, many new features that will help us not only to run our workload in a faster way, right? But also at the same time will help us to stabilize our workload, meaning that we won't see these problems of regressions because of we have bad plans or something like that, right? We will talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. So, as I said, many capabilities in SQL Server 2022, right? The most important ones were the one that I just mentioned, but they are not the only one, right? We will see that also there are enhancements in the T-SQL area, right? So developers will be able to write things using less code and let's say functions that are now part of SQL Server 2022 instead of us writing, crazy T-SQL code to accomplish something. Now for certain areas, we will have many new functions on this area. Then in the security, scalability, and availability area, there are also certain enhancements that we will mention through this presentation, right? So we mentioned it briefly before, connected with managed instance with Synapse Analytics PureView, but also for the very first time, we will be able to take advantage of Azure Active Directory and authenticate our logins with Azure Active Directory directly, right? At the same time, being able to use Microsoft Defender for SQL to do assessment, to check for malicious activity in our databases. So definitely really well integrated with Azure. All right, we will present this first challenge, right, which is being able to accomplish business continuity using managed instance. We all know that setting up a DR environment is quite hard if we talk about the on-premise environment, right? We need to get a new data center on a different location. We need to have the connectivity, etc. And then, with SQL Server and availability groups, we can do this synchronization synchronously, asynchronously, well, depending on our needs, right? But now, for the very first time, we will be able to do it very easily, right, between SQL Server 2022 and managed instance, right? So we will see it in action, and we can use the secondary replica as in the managed instance as read-only replica. So same as we do today with SQL Server, we can use it as the read-only source for multiple other systems, right? But we will also be able to do a failover, right, in case we need it. That means that if for some reason we have a problem in our main site in where we have SQL Server 2022 running, we can switch the roles, and now the read-write replica or the primary replica will become the managed instance, right? So the insert, updates, and deletes will go there. Right. So this is a really, really interesting concept that is super nice to have it available, right? Just for your information, this is in what is called private preview. So we can go download the SQL 2022 bit, right? But we cannot do this setup right away. We have to contact Microsoft. They have to do in this at this point in where we're still testing. Enable something specifically in our managed instance in order to do that, but it's totally possible, and I will show you how it works, right? As an additional flavor to this, we know that to move from SQL Server 2022 or from any SQL Server to managed instance, today we just need to take a backup of the databases and restore it to the managed instance, right? But as for today, SQL Server 2019, if we would like to take a backup of the managed database running managed instance, we cannot restore it back to SQL Server 2019 or 17 or any version, right? Well, now with SQL Server 2022, we can take a backup of the user databases in managed instance and easily restore them back to SQL Server 2022, right? This is something that was requested by customers and the community, and finally we see it with 2022. Then this new feature, Azure Synapse Link for SQL, right? In where we're trying to solve this challenge of handling ETLs, right? Extraction, transformation, and load. We know that, when we are doing BI and we are extracting data from our operational environments, we do this extraction on a schedule basis, right? Once a day, once every 6 hours, depends. So When we move the data to our warehouse and we start working on this, we are working on data that is already out of date, right? Because it's not real time. Well, for the very first time and really easily, right, we will be able to go to SQL Server 2022, select certain tables within our user databases and get them synchronized directly with a dedicated SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics. So we will see the operational data right away in Synapse, and with that, we can use all the power of Synapse, right? Doing machine learning, using Power BI at the top of it to do dashboards and reports with almost real-time data, right? This is really, really interesting to see it in action, right? So let's see these two features in action, actually, right? Being able to synchronize SQL Server 2022 and manage instance, and also Synapse Link for SQL, right? So here I have my virtual machine in Azure, right, in where I am connected to my SQL Server 2022, my managed instance, and my dedicated SQL pool in Synapse, right? So first of all, let's see how we should set up the managed instance link. So it's so easy. We go to one of the user database, right click, and now we have this new option called Azure SQL Managed Instance Link. And then we have two options, replicate database or failover, right? For the replicate database option, it will actually come up with a wizard that will help us to do the whole setup, right? First of all, it will check that availability group always on is enabled in our SQL Server. We'll check the versions, we'll check that we are sysadmin, and also at this point, Microsoft is recommending to enable these two trace flags, which basically will help with the setup. Then we'll also be checking the presence of a database master key and the endpoint. Next step will be quite similar to what we know today to set up an availability group, which is actually selecting the databases that we would like to add into the distributed availability group. So we select this one, we go next, right? And the next step basically will be to select, to connect to our Azure subscription, right? And select the managed instance. When we do that, it's gonna check, that the endpoint is there, and if it is not, it will create it. It will use the existing certificate that we have, and the final step will be just doing the whole thing for us, right? So what it's doing here is adding this database called SQL 2022 DB into a distributed availability group within managed instance, right? So if we go to our management studio, we go to always on high availability, and we see here I already have one database called DemoDB, and then the new one that we just added, SQL Server 2022 DB. You will see that it will create one availability group and one distributed availability group per database that we create, right? Then when we go to the managed instance, we will go here, and we already see DemoDB, which is part of the distributed availability group, and now we have SQL Server 2022 DB. Now they are synchronizing as any distributed availability group, right? And we just run the wizard and we got it there. So the next part of the demo basically will be just to see what we can do with this DemoDB. So for this second part, what I have in DemoDB is one table called sample table DB, right? In where I'm just going to do the select. This is my SQL Server 2022. We have 143 plus thousand rows in this table, and the first ID is 2201, right? Now here I am connected to, actually here, I am connected to the managed instance, you see down here, right? I'm also connected to the same demo DB and to the same table. And I see exactly the same amount of rows and the first ID, right? In this session, I am connected to the dedicated SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics, and I see exactly the same thing. So I will go to my primary, the SQL Server 2022, and what I will do here is I will delete some rows. So let's just go here to my primary. I deleted 100 rows, so I will go check, and we'll see that now my first ID is 2301, right? When I go back to my managed instance and I do the same select, I see that now again the first ID is 2301, so it's synchronizing. And eventually, if we go to the managed instance and we say, hey, I want to delete some rows from my table, guess what? We're gonna get the same message that we got on any read-only replica, right? We cannot do insert, update, or delete because the database is in read-only, right? And then finally, I go to my dedicated SQL pool in Synapse. I execute my query, right? And I see that is also replicated with the last ID that I got, right? So in this demo, I have my SQL Server 2022 in where the demo DB is synchronized with a managed instance asynchronously, and at the same time, I configure this table, sample table DB, to synchronize with the dedicated SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics. So this way, at the top of it, as I said, we can do any kind of business intelligence, machine learning, and Power BI with real-time data. Really, really impressive and interesting. All right, so let's go back to the demo. Sorry, to the script. And now we will talk a little bit about performance, right? And again, this journey in terms of performance features started back in SQL 2016 with Query Store, right? Query Store, which is this black box in where SQL is capturing all the runtime statistics and all the plan change, and starting SQL Server 2017, also the weights information for everything happening within my user database, right? This is Query Store, which in 2016, 17, and 19, Query Store was disabled by default, meaning if we create a brand new database, Query Store was disabled back then. This is not the case in Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. When we create a new database, Query Store is enabled by default. Well, now in SQL Server 2022, right, when we create a new database, Query Store is enabled by default. And you will see some of the new things that we can do with, having Query Store enabled in our user database. This is the second part of the performance capabilities, right? With intelligent query processing, right? Just to go back on a brief explanation of intelligent query processing, first of all, was introduced in SQL Server 2017 with the name of adaptive query processing, right? Then in 2019, branded as intelligent query processing, and now in 2022 is intelligent query processing next gen, right? And the whole concept of IQP is basically to solve this, regression problem that we used to see with some of our SQL Server workload, right? We all have seen this situation in where one specific report that runs every night, and we know that it normally takes 30 minutes, right? One day, out of nowhere, right? Without any code change, right? That thing that used to take 30 minutes is been running for 2-3 hours, and we don't know what's going on. Most probably is a new plan, right, which is not as efficient as it used to be. So with intelligent query processing, what Microsoft is trying to accomplish here is for certain situations in where SQL Server come with an execution plan and store it into cache and then reuse it for further execution, it's trying to do additional feedback, right? And providing this feedback back to the engine to adjust that plan that before was completely static. For example, the case that I like the most is the ones related to memory grant feedback, right? Again, when we execute the store procedure query for the very first time, it will come up with a plan, right? And we'll store it into the cache, right? For that plan, we will have, SQL Server will grant us certain amount of memory, let's say 10 megabytes, right? So in the upcoming execution, right, SQL Server will grant 10 megabytes for that execution. Let's say that, we execute it, and instead of using those 10 megabytes that we have granted, we ended up using 1 megabyte, right? We are going to be wasting 9 megabytes. You can tell me, well, wasting 9 megabytes is not a big deal, right? We have servers with a bunch of gigabytes of memory. But what if I tell you that this store procedure that we are talking about is being executed hundreds of times per minute, right? Every execution will be granted with 10 megabytes and will be using way less than what we get assigned. So we will see some performance impact because of pressure of memory that we are wasting. And what if it is the other case? We have 10 megabytes granted, but then we need more, like 20 megabytes, right? You know what SQL Server will be doing. It will execute the query, right? But it will be using the 10 dB to spill the data over there, right? And, fulfill that memory that was not granted initially. It will take forever, but we will have the result, right? So with memory grant feedback, what SQL Server is doing, right, is every time that we execute the procedure, SQL Server is giving the feedback on the real amount of memory that it ended up using, and for the upcoming execution, it will be adjusting it properly, right? So this way, the query plan is no longer static, and the memory grant will be adjusted for upcoming execution, right? This has started in SQL Server 2017, 17. And then in 2019, when this feature was rebranded as intelligent query processing, right? Microsoft was trying to, get more cases like this in where initially there was a problem with the execution plan, right? And need to be adjusted. And they introduced one of these other features called scalar UDF inlining, right? We all know that SQL Server, historically, when you have a query that is involving a scalar UDF function, is not doing very well because it's considering that the weight within the UDF is almost zero, right? But we know that there are many, many cases in where developers get quite creative and they put a lot of business logic within this scalar function. And then that function is used in the select, or even worse, within the predicate, right? And we know what SQL Server does in this case. And we start seeing these performance problems with CPU spikes and these kind of things, right? Well, back then, what Microsoft accomplished was that, now it's getting the plan of the UDF and then embedding it into the main execution plan. So then when we do the final execution, right, we have a way, way more accurate plan instead of considering that the scalar function has no weight. It's getting the real weight and the execution plan is better. So let's see a little bit what we can see with SQL Server 2022 in this area, right? The challenge is that it's still quite complex and expensive to tune queries, right? So what SQL Server is giving to us with this version? Well, first of all, with intelligent query processing next generation, it is relying a lot on query store for a bunch of purposes, right? There are two features, right? DOP feedback and CE feedback. DOP stands for degree of parallelism, and CE of cardinal estimation, right? Which, will help us to solve two of the problems that we see today, which are quite complex. For example, we all know that setting up the DOP for a specific query, for a user database, or even for the whole instance is quite complex, right? Depending on the amount of CPUs, cores, it can be, quite challenging. What if I tell you that now SQL Server with intelligent query processing VNext or next-gen, what it's doing is evaluating every single store procedure execution that we have within our user database and is proposing us with a better DOP for that statement within a single store procedure, right? So what do we have to do today? Well, first of all, we need to identify that this specific statement within a store procedure will run better with a lower DOP. Then we need to open the store procedure, add the hint, recompile it, execute it again, evaluate if the new execution is better in terms of resource usage, in terms of duration, CPU usage, etc., and then maintain that hint, right? The same for cardinal estimation, right? Let's say that we identify that there's maybe a hint that will make my statement run better. Maybe lowering down the CE level or adding a specific hint, right? Again, what do we have to do right now? Identify it, get the store procedure, add the hint, recompile it, wait for the upcoming execution, and verify, right? Well, now in SQL Server 2022, right, all this, the DOP and the CE hints are being done by the engine, right? What does it mean? For every single query running in our user database, SQL Server will identify if either the DOP or any specific hint is better for our execution. It will set it automatically for us without any code change, right? Meaning we don't have to modify the store procedure. And then it will verify that the upcoming execution will be better than before. And will maintain it over time using query store and persisting all this information within query store, right? Again, this is like putting our databases, the performance for our database in kind of autopilot, right? Because again, we don't need to do all the things that I told you before. Now SQL Server is doing it by ourselves, right? And then we have the possibility of having a version of the query store for the read-only replicas, right? We know that the workload that we have in our read-only replicas is quite different than the one that we have in our primaries, right? In read-only replicas, we mainly have extractions, long selects, etc. In our primary, we have a lot of transactions and these kind of things. Well, now we have a copy of the query store for the replicas, in where it's going to store different information than in the primary, right? So this is really, really nice, and we're going to take a lot of advantage of this, right? And then there is another thing that you see there, which is parameter-sensitive plan optimization, right? We will talk in a second. So how we can take advantage of CE feedback and DOP feedback? Well, first of all, having SQL Server 2022. Then using the latest compatibility level for our user database, which is 160, in where we will have these features available, and of course query store enabled by default. And then this other feature, parameter sensitive plan optimization, is trying to address a historical problem that we all have in SQL Server, which is parameter sniffing, right? How this works. Well, again, when we execute the store procedure for the very first time, we maybe use an input parameter, right? And SQL Server will get with the execution plan, right, based on that input parameter, and will store it into the cache. Then for upcoming executions, right, it will use that cache, even if we have a different input parameter that will require a completely different shape on the plan. It will use the one that we have already in cache, even if it's not the best, right? So to give you an example, what is happening today, let's say that we execute this procedure for the very first time with the parameter number 1, and it requires an index seek, right? Then let's say that we execute the store procedure again with the parameter 10, and it's more optimal to use a table scan instead of the index seek, right? So when we go back and use, with the parameter number 1, we will use the plan that is in the cache, which is not the optimal one. Now, with PSP optimization, what SQL Server 2022 will do for us is basically the first time that we execute with one parameter, it will come up with a seek. The second time, when we run it with a different parameter and it comes with a scan, what SQL Server will do for us for the very first time is keep 2 different plans for the same execution. So depending on which parameter we use, it's going to be using one plan or the other, right? This is, then you can come up and say, hey, what's happening if I use a different parameter, not 1 or 10, I use 5 or 100. Well, it's not going to store one plan for each parameter. It will only store 2 plans, and SQL Server will decide which one it is just in the best to the one that we have in cache, right? Really, really interesting. So let's see CE feedback and DOP feedback in action. So let me go to DOP feedback and show you a little bit what I'm doing here. So first of all, I'm restoring my database, I'm creating this store procedure called get stock item by supplier with an input parameter supplier ID. And then at this point, what I'm doing is configuring the max DOP for my user database to be 0, right? So this is not ideal, but just for the purpose of the demo, we have it configured as 0. And then I have created an extended event sessions that will help us to understand a little bit more what's going on behind the scene. Then I started the extended event session. And finally, what I'm doing here is making sure that Query Store is enabled for my worldwide importers database, clearing the Query Store and enabling DOP feedback. And finally, clearing the procedure cache, right? Then the next step is basically to execute this batch, which is basically calling that store procedure multiple times, right? So what SQL Server was doing while I execute this, right? First of all, and I'm not running it now, I ran it before, so we can see it now because it takes certain amount of time. At some point, right, it say, hey, this query, this procedure that you're running is eligible, right, for a DOP feedback. So checking the information down here is saying that, you know, if we run this with DOP 8, right, instead of using 53,000 millisecond, CPU millisecond, it will be using 23,000, right? So it's just identifying that running that store procedure that we see down here, right? This is the one that was executed through the external command line multiple times. Then we keep running that store procedure and say, hey, now I verified that running it with 8 is better, but we can also do 6 and it will run even better, right? So again, we were just running this store procedure multiple times, right? With the instance DOP set as 0, and SQL Server understood that for that specific store procedure statement within the store procedure, just running it with lower DOP will be better for, you know, using less CPU time. And it is doing it for us, right? We don't have to modify anything. We don't have to open the procedure. We don't have to put the hint, use hint DOP 8 or 6 or whatever. It's doing it for us and for all the workload within our user database. Really, really impressive. Then for C feedback, we're going to do something similar, right? So what I have here is I will create my extended event session called C feedback. Then basically what I'm doing is changing the compatibility level to 160 just to make sure that we are on the latest one, and clearing the query store information as well as the procedure cache for my user database. Then here, I'm creating a new store procedure called demo C, which is mainly doing a select, right? So I have created this, this store procedure. Now, what I will be doing here is I will go to my extended events again, see feedback, and I will get watch live data. Right? We still have nothing. So what I'm doing now is running my store procedure 15 times for the very first time. Right? So I'm just running it. Good. We will check these DMBs to see if we have anything. We have nothing. We check the extended event session is still empty. So what I'm going to be doing next is executing the store procedure one more time number 16, right? So I just running, checking my DMBs. I have something down here saying, hey, for this query, we have a proposal of using a specific hint, right, which is still in pending validation, right? So it's still not validated yet, right? We go to extended event session and we see the same. We have query feedback analysis and say, hey, if we use this specific hint, right, we will have a better execution time. Okay, interesting. I will run the store procedure one more time. Again, I will check my DMBs. And now the information that before was pending on validation now is saying verification passes. So now it's certain that using this hint will be better. And up here, we have the query ID and we have the hint that we are using it. And if I go to my extended event session, I see that now the query feedback validation has passed. And now we go down here, we see that, instead of having this original CPU time, now using this hint, right, it's using half of the time. And all this happened without us doing anything. We haven't done any code chain. SQL Server has done it automatically for us, and it is maintaining it, right? So since this information is persistent in query store, even if we restart the SQL Server instance, right, this information will be stored and reuse it, even if, as I said, the SQL Server start again, right? Because, again, it is using the information in query store, right? Super, super interesting. All right, going back to the slide. The challenge is using the power of blockchains in SQL Server. And what is this, blockchain or cryptography within our SQL Server, and what's the purpose of doing this? Well, we can create what is called ledger tables, right? In where, we can use them for any auditing system. Like the big, advantage of this table is that it is using blockchain. So they are impossible to alter. So nobody can tamper the data, even if we are sysadmins, right? So today, if we are sysadmin, and let's say we have a system to get, movements or an entry check or something like that, eventually someone with sysadmin rights will have the possibility of maliciously altering the data to fix or amend something, right? If today there is an external entity like a bank regulator or anything, we can easily provide a mechanism today that the data that we have on those specific tables are immutable, and nobody outside the application was able to modify it, right? So really, really powerful and useful for certain scenarios. Many more improvements in the engine, right? For example, more granularity with dynamic data masking, XML compression, right? For the very first time, we can compress XML. Of course, we won't be using a ton of disk, but we will be using more CPU, right, to compress, decompress. And then, many enhancements like, for example, shrink database concurrency, or being able to shrink our databases with low priority, something that today we have problems, right? Then, something really, really interesting that today we see in Azure SQL Database, Managed Instance, and also in Synapse is the possibility of being able to access to a modern object storage system through SQL Server 2022, right? Initially, we have this feature called Polybase, which allow us to get out of SQL Server, create external tables, and go to external database systems, right? Now, we will be able, with this, this Polybase v2, let's say, to access data that maybe is stored in an external database system or in a modern object storage system, like, for example, a storage account, a data lake in where we store Parquet, JSON, or CSV file. And we create these external tables, right? Then from SQL Server, we access this table directly, right? Like if it is a local table. Then, in terms of another challenge is that we need additional features for T-SQL without having to learn many more things, right? Well, SQL Server is giving us new set of T-SQL functions to do things that today we can do, but we need to write our own code. For example, if you have a list of values or characters or whatever you have, you can get the greatest or the least one, right? Today you have to use case, if, etc. Now you have a list of values, or even if you have multiple columns, right, you can get the greatest or the least, right? Enhancements in string split, right, and few others enhancements. Well, getting into the end, as a quick summary, SQL Server 2022, as you have seen, is Azure integrated, Azure enabled for disaster recovery, for managed instance, for analytics, right, with Synapse Link, and for security with Microsoft Purview. The built-in intelligence features reduce the need of doing additional query tuning and is gaining performance just out of the box without any code change, right? Many enhancements and a lot of innovation in security, scalability, and availability. Possibility of getting data virtualization through modern object storage, and enhancements in the T-SQL language just out of the box, right? Here are a few links that we have just to start with. Again, if you want to learn more about SQL Server 2022, aka.ms/SQL Server 2022, you will go to the official documentation, which again is still in preview, right? It's still not the final product, right? You can download SQL Server 2022, aka.ms/get SQL Server 2022. You can go there and download the release candidate 1 for SQL, for Windows or for Linux or even for containers, right? Here is when it was presented as a public preview. Bob Ward quoting, ourselves at MSC. We've been using SQL Server 2022 since the very beginning. We've been testing our workload over there, and especially as I said, we are taking a lot of advantage of the performance-related feature, but not the only ones. Right? We're trying to get advantage of all of them. Here, I give you a QR code for you to go directly to the documentation, to the what's new in SQL Server 2022, as well as for Azure SQL Fundamental. And with that, we end the presentation. A lot of things in a short period of time. I try to give you a sneak peek of the most important things in all the multiple areas that SQL Server has. You have seen it's a ton of new things, right? So it was a quick overview.